Al. Hey,
Hi,
Al.
Jill.
Hey,
Good to
Al.
see ya.
Bronwyn.
Been a couple years, I think.
We're
Yes.
recording. We are recording. Okay. Well, welcome everybody who's on and who's joining us for this month's Disability Ministry Video Roundtable. I'm Catherine Boyle with Key Ministry, and just delighted that you could be here today. We have a special guest joining us to talk about a really interesting concept and process that her church has gone through in the last year, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of good information to share, and then hopefully also feel free to share whatever questions, comments, maybe you've had your own experiences doing house church. So we'll get started here in just a second officially, but just a couple of housekeeping things before we're going. Feel free to ask all the questions you want, either in the chat or just raise your hand, and we'll work the questions and comments in with the rest of the conversation, but just make sure you don't use any identifying information or person's name, church name, particularly if there's a need to keep whatever the topic is, something that's private. So, well, we are already recording now. So again, thank you so much for joining today. And I am just delighted to introduce Jillian Palmiotto to the group. Probably many of you, or maybe even most of you, already are familiar with Jillian's work or know her personally. She's worked in special needs ministry for a long time, and she's done some really great things that we thought were just super creative in the last year. So we invited her on here today just to talk with all of you so that she can share some of what was learned in creating a house church network for special needs ministry. So Jillian, welcome to Video Roundtable today.
Thank you. I'm so excited. I'm a little nervous.
Oh goodness, no. We're a friendly group. So, well, if you don't mind, Jillian, just if you could just give a little brief background on your special needs ministry work, because I know you've done a lot. You've been involved for a really long time, and I don't want to get anything wrong. So it's best if you just tell us what you have done.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was, I started out in special needs ministry at my local church, where I have been attending church for over 20 years, and used to be a special education teacher. So I have a bachelor's degree in early childhood education, and then a master's degree in inclusive education for K through 12, and left the school system to launch our special needs ministry at our church. And that kind of grew from about 5 families that we had when we started out to over 170, I think, when I actually left my position last year. And at the time, I think we had 173 families in our special needs ministry. So it grew quite significantly over the time that I was there. And then during that time, we also began to get a lot of questions from churches in our area. I'm located in the Metro Atlanta area, and we started getting a lot of questions from church leaders about how to better include people with disabilities. And so I was like, well, let's do a workshop. And then that turned into a conference. And now we have a full-blown conference for churches to train up people to do special needs ministry and disability ministry and inclusion ministry and all that entails. And then this past January 2021, the Lord launched me out into a brand new adventure of starting a nonprofit where I can be more helpful to even more churches with consulting and helping them build and creating plans to make their ministries more inclusive and make sure that they have a welcome place for everybody who walks through the door. So that's called Together We Care. And so now I am learning how to run a nonprofit.
Which has its own wrinkles and unique challenges, but it's all good.
Yes, it's all good. It's all good. So yeah, so we did kind of, COVID came and we said, oh, okay, what do we do? So Catherine, I don't know if you have certain questions for me, if you want me to just start telling you my experience, like.
Well, yeah, so quickly though, I'm going to put your website in the chat so everybody can
Okay.
see that. So I know it's Together We Care, but if you could just give me the URL, that would be great.
Yes, it's www.togetherwecaregA.org. And that doesn't mean we only service Georgia, but it just was the only URL that was left because everyone apparently likes to care together. So that's
Interesting. Okay. Good naming choice, right?
that's right.
Well, yeah, so I don't even know how we got into this conversation a few months ago about what you had done last summer, but it was kind of a beautiful story of we're all in that same boat, right? Like right around the same time. I mean, it's been a glorious year of COVID now, right?
Yes.
You know, maybe this weekend or last weekend was probably the first weekend that your church did not meet. And so yeah, I remember that being just the most eerie and strange thing. And so, quickly we started doing Idea Share, which turned out to be really a very helpful forum for many who are on this call and others as well. But then Jillian, you took it even a step farther. And so I'd love for you to just kind of give a little background on what led you to creating a house church network for special needs ministry.
Yeah, sure. So, so our experience with our church, our church is actually located in the city limits of Atlanta. And so we had some pretty restrictive, we were kind of one of the hot spots. And so we had some pretty intense restrictions from our local governments about what we could and couldn't do with church and all of that. And so, of course, when, this time last year, we were like, oh, it's whatever it was, 14 days to flatten the curve or whatever that lie was, right? So we had that, and we were like, oh, okay, we're going to close church because that's safe, it's the right thing to do, blah blah blah. And so we're going to close for 2 weeks, and that, walking into March 2020, that's what we thought was happening. And so, everybody was kind of like, oh, well, this is a nice little, like, okay, this is scary, like, oh, we don't know what to expect here, but we're going to stop and take a breather from life, right? And it was almost like that you kind of had this lull, and everybody kind of went into like a little bit of a vacation mode, like we have to quarantine, we don't like it, but at the same time, it's kind of nice to not have to go to work, so then everything began unfolding, like, oh, it's really not going to just be 14 days, right? And the realization of what we were facing was beginning to set in. And so then we started getting word as a staff at our church, that like, okay, things are not reopening. We got to come up with some different methods. And so we did the same thing every other church did. How can we get online? How can we do children's programming different? How can we do youth programming different? How are we going to do women's ministry and men's ministry and special needs ministry? How is all that going to look different? And so we started brainstorming on Zoom, of course, because it was the only choice. And, started doing all of those kind of things. Well, so we started plugging away and started building our online platforms. We saw in special needs ministry, as we began to try to launch things on Zoom, it wasn't really working for us. The parents were needing a break, and sitting with their child to manage Zoom wasn't helpful. It certainly wasn't helpful since they were in virtual school and they were having to do that already Monday through Friday. So the last thing they wanted to do was do it on Sunday. What they wanted was their kids to keep sleeping so that they could go to the living room and enjoy church. So that they weren't bothered, right? And they could drink a cup of coffee and enjoy a sermon. And so we saw very quickly that wasn't really going to work. And so we continued trying some different things with Zoom. And then we got word from our pastor that we were going to be able to reopen in June. So it was only from March till June, wasn't really that long. It was painful those 3 months. It wasn't, but okay, this is good. We're going to start getting back. And then they said, no, you're not doing that. So the restrictions set in. And so then we were like, oh gosh. And so it was crazy because with the special needs families, as the minister of the ministry, I saw these very similar. It was like everybody was going through a same emotional pattern, right? So there was this huge panic when everybody got the email from the school that we were going to virtual school. The parents freaked out and they were all ready to run away. They were all calling me. I'm like, okay, listen, And listen, if Job can go through what Job went through, we can do virtual school. It's okay. Talking parents off the ledge. And so then, it was like this, like my phone's blowing up, I'm trying to pray with people and read scripture with people and trying to talk people off the ledge. And then everybody got into a routine. Everything was good. We got in the routine of virtual school, all that. Everybody was kind of striving towards spring break. And then spring break came, we got a little bit of a rest. And then we were back in the race for the end of school. Everything was good. And we were striving towards summer. And so they were excited about water parks opening, vacation. We just need it. We need to get out of this pandemic, whatever. We need to get back to church, and church is reopening in June. Well, at the end of May, we began to get word, all the amusement parks are closed. You can't go on vacation. There's nobody driving from Georgia to Florida. All the beaches are closed, everything, blah, blah, blah. And then I had to make the difficult phone call to our family saying church is also closed. And when I tell you the emotion that ran through those families, it was very disheartening. And I began to realize that what our families needed more than anything else at that time was their community. They needed their church community. And I was like, I just went to the Lord in prayer and said, Lord, like, how in the world are we going to create this community? Because by June, we were beginning to really realize what a pandemic meant, which meant we weren't coming back to church for a while. Right. And so I really felt like the Lord just kind of downloaded this plan into my spirit about house churches. And I began to reread and study the book of Acts, and really began to just model, like, okay, well, in disciples' days, they didn't have church. So what did they do? Like, the model's already there for us. Let's look back in the book of Acts, and kind of went to, I think it was Acts 2 or 4. I can't remember off the top of my head, but where it talked about them sitting in, the Spirit of God moving in and among the people in house church. And I was like, there it is. It's right there in scripture. We need to be getting back to house churches, And I think that the churches have known this for a little while, right? Because there has been a big push, maybe in the last like 5 years or so, to start doing small groups, and sometimes, some people call them discipleship groups, small groups, life groups, whatever you want to call them. It's house church, and so this was kind of a new take on what small groups. And our church really doesn't do small groups. We don't have a big push for that, because our congregation is what's what we call a commuter church. We have people that drive like over an hour to get to our church for some reason, even though we live in the Bible Belt, and they might pass 50 churches getting there. Like, I don't know why they all make the drive, but our average commute is about 30 miles from our church. And so it's not your average like community church where everybody just lives around the corner. And so that also brings its own unique challenges. And so I was like, okay, I need a plan for how to create these house churches. Like, we have these 170 families and that's family units. So that's not 170 people. That's like over 500 people that we need to establish who lives around them, who can they partner with, who can be part of their life group, their community group, who can we get together with to watch church. And the funny thing was that when I went to the Lord in prayer, and I felt like he led me to that passage in Acts that said house church, I literally, y'all, this is, don't judge me, but I literally had a 4-day argument with God. Okay. Like, I was like, Lord, are you telling me that, like, I know where these families are emotionally, and what I think I'm hearing you say to me right now is that you want me to call up a family that is struggling financially. They're struggling there with their careers. They're homeschooling their children all of a sudden. They have a child with autism and that child's siblings. And you want me to call them up and ask if we can host church at their house? Like, what? So it's like, I'm not doing that. I am not doing that to this family. I got super rebellious there for like 4 days. And so then so I'm arguing, like I had, I felt like the Lord had kind of led me to that, like on Sunday in my prayer. And y'all, Thursday of that week, you cannot make this stuff up. I'm not lying about this story. I'm not exaggerating. the mom of the one name that I felt like the Lord dropped into my spirit, the mom calls me up on Thursday morning and she says to me, this is going to sound so weird, but we were watching church on Sunday in our living room, and we are just so tired of not being with people, and we need to be around people. And we were wondering if you and your family would come and watch church with us at our house. And I was like, you're funny. You're funny. So I was like, oh, not only will we come and watch church with your family, but I have about 3 other families that live near us that I'd like to bring with us. Is that okay? So she was like, oh my gosh, that would be so great, because we are just feeling so isolated. Like, out of anything that we need right now, we are just really not dealing with the isolation well at all. And so we really need people. And so she was like, we definitely want to be safe. We want to follow the CDC guidelines. So, can we ask everybody to wear masks? Can we make sure we keep it to 20 people? Because we live in a suburb, and in our suburb at the time, that was the restriction from the government, was no gatherings more than 20. And so she was like, so let's not invite any more than 20 people. And of course, at the time, some people were still uncomfortable from, they were still quarantining. Some people were still sheltering in place and not going out. And so once we did the invite, it was about 5 families that we invited, including our family. No, I guess we had about 6 families that we invited, and including ours, we had 4 total that showed up. So we had about 12, 13 people that came to that first one. And it was just glorious. I mean, we just got together in somebody's living room. We turned on our church service to the church that we belong to. We streamed it online. We all stood in the living room. We worshiped, we raised hands, we worshiped together, and, got to fellowship after. We didn't do any big shindig. There was no plan for lunch. There's no permission forms. There's none of any of the other stuff that you have to do when planning a church event, right? It was just, this is just our family, and we're just getting together with our church family in somebody's house. And so it's not really any different than the model of small groups, other than we're watching church together and we're participating in worship together. I think for me, that was the thing that got me, is that's what's different than it being like a small group or a life group or whatever, was that we got together and we prayed together, we worshiped together, and then we dove into God's teaching by our pastor. It wasn't another lay person that was leading us, or what. And not that that's a bad thing. Like, we're all called to disciple one another, right? But there was something different about it, that we still got to tune in and hear the word from our senior pastor, and the word that the Holy Spirit had given him for that week for us to hear. And so we went to town, assigning everybody to house churches.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, so many questions. So I want to take a little break.
Yes. Okay.
What you guys, who are participating would like to ask, because I can think of several things off the top of my head, like, do they have a giant house? How did you get that many people in their living room, right? I mean, do you have to have a giant house to be the house church, right? But, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, but I'm sure others are having different questions that might be, more relevant than the size of the living room. So,
right.
Yeah, feel free to raise your hand. There's a little way that you can do that, or just jump in, and I can.
Well, and while people are doing that, I'll answer your question. You don't have to have a big house. It wasn't a humongous house. And you think, listen, if you can host your own kid's birthday party at your house, like you invite families over for birthday parties, you have 10, 12, 13 people over for your kid's first birthday party. Everybody's coming over to see that little one candle on that cake, right? So if you can do that, you can invite people into your house to talk about Jesus.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, so Amy, a couple of questions are coming up in the chat, and thank you so much for that. So Amy Troyer asked, how many families had a special needs child that came to the house churches?
So they were all centered around the special needs families, right? And so, so for most of our house churches that we were putting in place, and y'all, this was a slow process. So don't think that like I took all 170 addresses and had everybody assigned, and the very next week we were doing house church model. That is not what happened. It was a very slow process that we started with the one house, and then that one house expanded to 2 houses, and then those 2 houses expanded to 4 houses. And so, it probably took us the first, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks to even just get 5 that were running well or whatever. And then we, just kind of slowly expanded from there. And so in the house churches that I went to and participated in, we did not have, I'm trying to think back, but we did not have more than 2, probably 2 kids with special needs at the time, in those families that were coming out, that were not sheltering in place. Probably, I think our one that we had the most kids with special needs or teens that had special needs, it probably wasn't more than 4, like 4 or 5 that would have been in the house at the same time that had some type of disability.
So for the most part, the family that had a child with special needs was the one that did the hosting. Is that what I'm
Not
hearing?
necessarily. That was just so the way that I kind of chose the host was I really looked at the fruit of their spiritual walk. And that's not for us to judge. Like, I don't want y'all to hear that. Like, it wasn't that I was, trying to judge, like, oh, let me look at the outward everything and let me decide who I think is the most spiritual of the group. Like, not like that, but just people who are, that I knew were, that they were, I know that they live a life of prayer. I know that they are training up their kids in reading the word. I know that they, they're involved in Bible studies. They, they go to church regularly. Like, I knew that they were tuning in to online church already. So, so just taking in some of those factors. So it wasn't necessarily just our special needs families, because I did also assign all of our volunteer team to those. So basically, when I say I assigned our ministry, I'm talking about all of our, like, we only have 2 paid staff members in our ministry, but, the 2 of us, and then like all of our leadership team, our volunteers, all of the parents, all the siblings, all the kids that have special needs. So all of those people were assigned. So some of them were like, we hosted a house church. And so, like that, I just looked at our address and looked at people who lived within a 5-mile radius that were involved in our ministry, that we could invite to our house church that wasn't more than 20, and so things like that were the people. Some of them were staff members that I chose, like our music ministry assistant, chose her as a house church person. So just different. It just kind of depended, and really it just was covered in a lot of prayer. I didn't assign any house churches that I didn't pray about first. So lots and lots and lots of prayer, lots of seeking the Lord about who is the right person, who's the right couple, the right family to host this or whatever. And so so it wasn't necessarily a special needs family that hosted it, but in some cases it was. But we didn't ever have any house churches that had more than 4 or 5 special needs kids.
Okay. Well, so Samantha Jones asked, what were the kids doing during service time?
So we haven't gotten there yet. So there's the answer to that question. But I will tell you that I did feel like the Lord gave me a good vision for what that needed to look like. And so I'll kind of share that with you. So at the beginning, even now, when we host a house church, it's still just all of the families gathering together in the living room. So what are the kids doing? They're walking around the living room. Like, the reality of it is that's what they're doing. And, and they're playing with their Polly Pockets, or they're playing with their Matchbox cars, or, they're walking around playing with their sensory toy or whatever. But as we began as I began to see the house churches unfold, I was able to really kind of watch the group and go, okay, we need buddies, right? Because at our church, we have a buddy system because we really push full inclusion with everybody as much as possible, unless they just really need a separate space. And so we have a buddy model where everybody has a one-on-one volunteer. Well, our volunteer teams were also invited to these house churches. And so it was kind of cool to watch. What would happen is you would have like a teen buddy who normally serves in our ministry at church on Sunday anyway, just gravitated toward the child that had the special needs, right? And they would sit and they would play with them, and they're kind of like half listening to the sermon and half, kind of paying attention to the kids. And so I was watching like this thing happen where the parents are still getting the break, right? They're still getting the respite that they need for church. Like that's why they love coming to church, because they can drop their kids off and they don't have to think about them. And so they were still being able to receive the respite while somebody else is kind of being the buddy in the living room. And I was like, oh, we need children's programming in this house church right now. Well, beautiful thing is that now we got millions of choices of children's and teen programming. And so our church did go to an online format for our children's and teens, and ours is just for my personal experience, we have like a nursery and preschool online platform where we do lessons with our nursery and preschoolers every week. And then we have a grade school platform, middle school platform, and then high school platform. And so I was like, okay, how do we get this content into this house at the same time while the adults are watching adult church, right? And so I was like, dining room, hello, we just need to go in the other room. We just need a computer screen or another television, or we need a guest bedroom that has a television in it or whatever. And let's pull up on YouTube and let's do the children's lesson. And you just have to look at the group. And if you've got 5 kids with special needs in there and 3 of them are teenagers and 2 are preschoolers, or you got a preschool and a grade school, well, then we need to, take these 2 in one room to do the grade school or preschool lesson. And we need this other group to go over here, and just kind of naturally you just choose a leader out of the house church that's already assigned to that house church to be the leader and the facilitator of that lesson. So again, you're not asking anybody to really teach the gospel. You're still relying on the pastors who are called to that, and you're looking for who would be a good facilitator of that, of that like lesson or whatever. And then to me, the third tier of that would be really stepping out into the mission field, right? And so our mission field is our neighborhood. Like, I think if we've learned anything through COVID, that part of it is we have to get out of the pews of the church. We've got to get out of the pews and start bringing the gospel to our community. And so like I saw, like with our online, I host like a Tuesday night online Bible study for our special needs moms. And I was like, you know what? I need to start inviting my neighbors to come to this. And so I just like sent out an email to our neighborhood HOA, like, hey, we have a house church, or like, we have a house church on Sunday if anybody wants to show up. Or, we're doing this online Bible study if anybody's interested or whatever. And so what is cool is that very first house church that we established, my husband and our family used to actually live in the same neighborhood as these people. And I knew, and I didn't know all of my neighbors in that neighborhood. I only knew, just like 1 or 2 of them. But what I did know was that down the street from us, I knew that there was another house that had a child with special needs, because I saw the special ed bus that would come to pick them up. They had a specialized bus with a lift and all of, harnesses and all of this kind of stuff. And so I was like, oh man, I bet you those people don't belong to a church anywhere. Why in the world are we not using house church model? I know that a person with a disability lives in that house because I saw the bus come and pick them up. So right. Guess what our next step is? Our next step is going to that door and saying, hey, we've got house church and we have a child with special needs living 3 doors down from you. And we want to connect with you, and we want to invite you into our faith community. Would you be willing to come and do church with us?
Well, yeah, and that's a fabulous next step. I definitely agree. We got a question though about how you guys have gotten this going, and it's a good one from Andrea. Andrea says, how did you monitor security for the protection of the kids? Did you only allow buddies and workers who had pre-COVID been involved in the ministry to be in attendance at the new house church, assuming that they would have gone through, the volunteer
background
training,
checks.
Whatever you have, the background check, all that kind of thing. So how did you handle that?
Yeah, well, yeah. So it is only people who have been previously background checked, but I will tell you, but then when you're bringing the other family members were not necessarily background checked because they didn't serve with our ministry, right? And so that is one of the questions that we kind of had, like, okay, how do we monitor this? And as we watched it, kind of unfold, I don't think that it needs to be as strict necessarily as it is in the church building, because it really is, you're all there in one room together, right? The parents are there, the siblings are there, everybody's there together, and you can argue that at church as well, that like, well, we don't ever have, at church we have like the 3-person rule, which I'm sure everybody else has that, right? Like you can never be alone with a child or anything. Most certainly you have to have that rule in place. Like, don't ever allow a leader to take, oh, we're going to go over here and do the children's lesson over here in this, in a bedroom. Like, no, that ain't happening. Like, we're going to take a group of people over here, to watch this television or whatever, but definitely consider where are the open spaces. Like if you live in an area that it's nice and the weather's good, do it outside in the front yard, do it in the dining room. If there's a sitting room, if you can separate living room from kitchen, and just because really all you need is a laptop. Like most people, I wouldn't encourage people to like go into bedrooms, so I would just encourage, like, most people have multiple televisions though in their house, or like a laptop or something that you can be mobile and be close enough by where it's still safe and you're still within the realm of the whole group of people. So you do definitely have to take those precautions if you're going to move forward with the house church model. I would say, in the go forward, I think it's a good idea to just go ahead and background check everybody. Like you might as well just go ahead and implement the things that you have, in your space, especially when you start getting out into like that community model. Like if you're inviting neighbors, you really don't know who you live next to.
Exactly.
Right?
And many people may not be comfortable coming unless they do know that there has been some sort of background check.
Yes.
Really, if there's children involved. I mean, that's just the reality that we all live
That's
with.
right. That's right.
Well, Amy asked about, what about children or teens that have behavioral issues? Did you, there had to have been some in the house church network. So how is that dealt with, by the folks that were meeting in the home?
For us, it was actually easier than church, believe it or not, because the kids were more comfortable. It was, and we, like, one of them was a home of a kid who has some behavioral issues. And so when I approached the mom about like, hey, how would you feel about this? The kid was actually more comfortable doing church and was a whole lot nicer to be around than he is at church, because it was his home environment. Right. And so he was cool with people coming to his home. Like he kind of liked that. And so for us, the behavioral issues were actually easier because there was less transition. It was a much smaller group. It wasn't, we have like a humongous church. And so for us, you don't have to navigate the parking deck and walking through multiple sections of a building and checking into one room and meeting up with your buddy and then being transferred to the children's or teen area or what, that a lot goes in to an inclusive ministry at a big church. Right. And so if you don't have to have the fight, like I had this one of the ladies who attends our house church called me up and we chose to do our house church at 5 p.m. And that's the other just kind of side note. That's the beautiful thing about house church is you don't have to keep it at 9 and 11 o'clock on Sunday morning because it's live streamed at that time, but it's available anytime. So you can do it at Tuesday at 3 if you want. And so we chose to do ours on Sunday evening. And the mom called me up and she was like, hey, so I know that it's 4:30 already in the afternoon and we probably should be dressed and we should have our teeth brushed, but Cyrus doesn't. She said, is it okay if we don't brush his teeth before we come? Girl, I don't care. They did not even have to have the argument that they have every Sunday morning about we're brushing your teeth and we're brushing your hair and we're getting dressed before we go to church, because it was just, we're going to Jillian's house, get in the car, and it's 5 minutes away. And so, so what we saw was that a lot of the, some of the behaviors that we typically see at church were not present in house church. And so that's not to say that that's going to be the case every time. Obviously, every child that has a behavioral issue, you need to have some, you need to talk through that with the family first, talk about what that's going to look like, because we have some kids in our ministry that when they are home, the parents are waiting for the kid to get older so that they can renovate because they have multiple holes in the wall. I mean, that is the reality of a special needs family, right? That things are broken. Lamps are broken. We can't have nice things because everything gets knocked off, or those kind of things. And so certainly that is a conversation that you have to have with the host family if you know that you're inviting a child with a behavior disorder into the home. And it's a conversation that you have to have with the family who has the child with the behavior disorder. What does this look like? Would it be more comfortable for you guys if we hosted at your house? Would it, how do you feel about it? And I don't know, we just tackled problems the same way we do at church. Like if a behavior outburst happens, okay, here we go. What are we gonna do about it? And if that means that for that family that you maybe for that family, it's better that your church partners with them to provide respite care for the child in their home so that the parents can go down the street to house church, and you provide a respite care provider, a caretaker for the kid in the home to do children's church in their own home with just them, or you just have to try to think outside the box.
Right. Well, and just you mentioned something about but before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of how you did it, because I think that's an important aspect of this for everybody who's on the call. You mentioned something about our neighborhoods are our mission field, and that's absolutely true. I mean, we actually did one of the very early Inclusion Fusion Lives that we did. We had a segment on relational respite and how important it is, if to have kind of that kingdom mindset that, all of life is ministry, and just to be awake and aware of the people who live around you. So a woman who's been on our board off and on is the head of our prayer team now. She reached out to a family that she really didn't know very well in her neighborhood, but it was a mom who had a child who had noticeable special needs. And I think that the first time she went over to introduce herself, the mom was having a bad day, and but she wanted, the ministry board member wanted to know how she could be helpful. And the mom said, honestly, I need help cleaning my house. And so she came in and she took up a broom or a mop and she helped her tidy up her house. And they have been lifelong friends as a result. And her special needs child became very comfortable with their family because it's their neighbor. They were able to just drop in, like you do with friends, neighbors who become friends. And so, any kind of official ministry thing they wanted to do was ezy because the kid knew them and was already familiar with their house, or, familiar with them being in the child's house.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously that takes time. That's not something that can easily be done this week.
That's right.
But you can get started this week.
That's right. You can start with one house church because that's how we started. Just one house church. And I'm gonna try to quickly share a story about something related to that and the relationship that happens with these groups. And so that very first house church that we started, we had the, like I said, the 4 families that were consistently coming to that house church. And one of the people who hosted ended up I guess it was probably around October, they were traveling and got into a really bad car accident. And they were all okay, had to go to the hospital. Mom had a kind of banged up knee. The girls were a little scratched up, that kind of thing. Dad had hurt his foot, all of that sort of thing. And so they get into this accident and the mom calls me, from the hospital and said, hey, we've been in a bad car accident, whatever, would you just pray with me? And we just need prayer. And she was really just calling for prayer. And so I did that. And then when they got home, I checked in with them and I said, how are things going? And this happened to be on Halloween, and we do this big, like we did this big drive-through fall festival thing where the kids could come in and do little activities from their car and get like a goodie bag and all this stuff. And she said, you know, she said the crazy thing is that out of all, like we've lost the car, like we're banged up, we're sore, we're hurting, we got hospital bills now, and the only thing that the girls are worried about is that the fact that we can't come to the festival. That was all they cared about. And I said, okay, you know what? I'll grab them some super big goodie bags. I'm going to fill it full of candy. I'm going to get all of the balloon decorations. I'll bring a carload full of balloon decorations, and I'll come drop it off at your house on my way home. That was such a blessing to the girls. And so I go to the home, I drop off, they were all excited. It was a glorious end to the day, right? And I look at mom and dad, and they're both on crutches, special needs parents, both hobbling around on crutches. And I was like, I thought you said everything was fine. It doesn't look so fine to me right now. And she was like, well, maybe it's a little worse than what we really told you. And I was like, y'all have to ask for help. Please tell me if you need help. And so she said, okay, I promise, a pinky promise, we will ask for help. And so then 2 days later, she said, you know, like, hey, you know, we really could just use help with food. Like, could y'all bring us a meal? My assistant went and picked up a meal for a couple of days, enough food for a couple of days, went and dropped it off at their house, provided a meal. And then she called me like a couple of days later, hey, like I can't walk around the neighborhood with the girls, and, you know, and they're still in virtual school. Do you have anybody who lives near us that could just come and take the girls for a walk? And so I called one of the people who, it was a teenager who happened to be out of school like that week or whatever. And I was like, hey, can you go over and just babysit? You know, like the mom just needs a nap and she needs you to just take the girls out to play because she can't walk around. Would you mind going and babysit? So she picked a day and she went and babysat the girls and, you know, volunteered to do that. And then she was like, oh, I don't, you know, I can do it, but my mom's working, so I don't have a ride. No problem. I'll come pick you up and drop you off at their house. Another house church member will take you back home, you know? And so it created this really great community. And then one of the other families who also comes ended up having a flood. Their water heater broke. Well, the house church group went over, helped them pack up their house because they had to pack up the whole house for renovations or whatever after the house flooded. And so, you know, so it was just, and I was like, oh man, here we are actually doing the work of the church. Here we are being the church to one another. And now we don't have to rely so heavily on the church as an institution to do all of this work for us, right? And I had this pastor tell me one time, like, Jillian, you don't understand. People look at the church building as an institution, the same way that they look at the homeless ministry institution, the same way they look at the government program, the same way a lot of people look to the church to care for them in ways that the church wasn't necessarily intended. That the church staff, I guess, I don't know what exactly what I'm trying to say by the church, but it's the church building, right? like the church as a building was never really intended to take care of them, but God's people, the church, were intended to take care of people in that way. You know what I mean? And we have now taken hands off. We've gotten to a place in the American church where we've taken our hands off of doing the helping because I wrote my tithe check, and that's the church's job. No, you're supposed to write your tithe check and go do the work. You know?
Right. Well, just a quick question here from Victoria. She asked if you saw a need for training the small groups, or, you know, the house churches that were meeting together.
No, because they were just doing church, just like Sunday. There wasn't any kind of, you know, like I said, they didn't have to.
So nobody was like an official leader or a facilitator or offering any kind of commentary. It was all just like if you were sitting in the pews or your worship center on a Sunday morning.
Yep.
Around friends.
Yep.
You know,
you just got a recliner couch instead of a pew. Yay. Yeah. And so, yeah, so no, there really wasn't. I mean, we have not done any kind of training, any kind of, I mean, it's really just hospitality. Like if you have somebody who's good at hospitality, come on in, you know, and we didn't, you know, like I said, we don't offer food. Like some of them, we have one guy who his gift, the people whose house flooded, they ended up like being our second like host family, because they just loved it so much. And they were like, oh, we want to have people over to our house too. And he has such, I mean, it is truly his spiritual calling is like cooking and serving people. He loves food. He loves to bless people in that way. So when we went to his house, he had a whole spread of stuff, like 3 tiers of fruit and cupcakes. And I mean, it was great, but none of the rest of it. I'm like, y'all want water? There's the kitchen sink. Like, you know what I mean? So there wasn't really any need. And, you know, and people just kind of, I feel like it really has given people this freedom to experience church the way church is intended, right? Like if somebody goes, hey, can I pray before we leave? If they feel led to pray and the Holy Spirit says, hey, you need to pray over this group before they leave, then they just pray, you know? And so, and it's funny because you will see the natural leaders kind of take on a leadership role in the group because they just don't know how not to do that if they're natural born leaders, you know? And so they'll be the kind of like, okay, everybody come sit down, church is starting, you know, or okay, like, hey, we're gonna pray real quick, or, you know, like, hey, do you mind taking the kids off to the dining room? Like, you know, you'll just see the natural leaders kind of take charge on their own. But there's really not any training involved because it's just church.
Right. Well, I've got just a couple of questions that I want to ask before we get to the top of the hour, which is only like 10 or 15 minutes away. So make sure if you've got some questions, put them in the chat, raise your hand. But I'm wondering a couple of things. Number one, you know, what kind of tool, you know, technology did you use to figure out where people live? And then number two, how did you go about getting buy-in from your church to try this?
I did it.
Okay.
I just did it. Then what are they going to do? Like, we're doing it.
Yeah.
If you're a rule follower, please don't follow that advice.
But it's better to ask forgiveness than permission, right?
That is literally my theme in life. So you know, I just felt and like I said, I did truly feel like that this whole idea was inspired by the Lord, because I am not creative enough to come up with this on my own. And so I don't know, I just didn't feel like I needed to ask permission. Like, if God tells you to do something, just do it. You know, like, so yeah, so we'll get to that in a second. Like, there was buy-in because I just created it. I mean, we just did it. But what was the first part of the question?
Like, what kind of technology did you use? Like, you know, like Google Maps? Did you use something else that, you know, because you no doubt have like a list of some kind, you know, of the people who are in special needs ministry.
Correct.
And then a list of all the church members, but, you know, how did you put them all together?
Yeah. So we use a database called Arena that several churches use. And it's just that, you know, there's several database platforms out there, like database tools. And so certainly your church most likely has some type of database platform that they use. And so ours, I went to my computer and I was like, okay, you know, when I started trying to think through how in the world, I don't know where all 170 of these families live. I don't, you know, I'm not geographically gifted enough to even if I did know, to know who lives near who, unless it just has the same city name or the same zip code, right? And so I was like, I wonder if our database has anything like that. And sure enough, the Arena database, you can go in and it has a proximity feature, and you can go under the proximity tab and you can type in whatever the radius is that you want, and you can search every single member of your whole entire church that lives within a certain mile radius of a particular address. So as the names would come to me of people who I wanted to ask if they would host, I would call them up and say, hey, would you be willing to host a house church or whatever? And this is kind of what it looks like, and this is what the model is. And would you be willing to do that? And if so, I will supply the people if you'll just supply the space. Mm-hmm. And so then I just would type in their address and I would pull up, you know, everybody that lived within a 5-mile radius of them. Now, because we have a humongous church, some of them, especially in the city, like the ones who lived in Atlanta, that's a tight space, right? Like it's an urban space. So there, I might get back like 6,000 names in the database. And so it was a very, very tedious process of literally just sitting and just going through and going, okay, which names do I recognize? Because as the ministry leader, as the special needs ministry leader, I know the name of every volunteer and the name of every family member. And
Right.
so I just have that in my head, and so it was really just comparing the names of the people in the list to the names that I got that Arena generated from the area that I was looking. But if you don't have something that's that sophisticated, you really could just look by, just sort. You can even put stuff in an Excel spreadsheet and you can sort it by zip code, or you can sort it by city name, or things like that, and just begin to use like tools like Google Maps to map it. And that will take more work to do it that way. But that's why this is a very slow process of, maybe if you can establish one house a week, you will be doing good, so.
Mhm. Well, Bronwyn said in the
I-
chat, they did something similar using Church Community Builder.
Yeah.
And so maybe others are using that as well.
Yeah. And I really loved, if y'all
I-
didn't see Bronwyn's, her comment earlier is about like, most of our churches are limited by space, right? Like we're always constantly fighting for volunteers and space and money. Yes.
Right.
Can I get an amen? And so this alternative really does provide, it really does literally shatter the church walls, because if you're taking the church model, you're taking the house church model outside the walls of the church, well, you have this great naturally inclusive model that you've got typical kids, special needs kids, you've got typical adults, adults with disabilities that are all in this one little community group together in this house church, that you don't need to worry about space. You don't need to worry about reserving the room on Sunday morning because it's somebody's house. so all the traditional things that we know about church and about working on a church staff or leading a ministry, they all kind of just go away with house church, which I love. I do love systems, but I don't like following them sometimes.
Hello.
All right, so somebody, area code 404 is trying to ask a question. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I came in late because I had another appointment. But
Oh, no worries.
I wanted to know how do you include individuals with visual disability?
With vision, well, actually, our ministry does not have any that we don't currently have any that have visual disabilities. But I would just use the same accommodations that you would use, when you're at church, like, like the same, if they are whatever they naturally use in their everyday life, like if it's a child or a teenager, they should have some things written in their IEP for school that they typically use to kind of like navigate school. So you would just use those same accommodations in your house church. And if it's an adult with a disability who, they certainly have some accommodations that they use to get around, for transportation. You just have to figure out what are the barriers, and then ask the person, how are we going to get over these, because they're doing life. I mean, they're living life. So you got to just use what they're already using. There doesn't really need to be any, there needs to be specialized accommodations put in place, but there doesn't need to be any reinventing of the wheel, if that makes sense. So.
Right. And what was the name of the database that the young lady mentioned?
It's Arena, ARENA.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, another question in the chat is, are you planning to continue this when church is back fully, when
Yeah, so
everybody's
our
back
church
together?
is fully back we are back fully functioning. We started back in August, the end of August. And so, yes, because some of our, and I think across the board, as I have been talking to church leaders, attendance is hovering right now at about 20 to 30% of what it was pre-COVID.
Right.
Across the board. And so that means a lot of people have either gotten very comfortable with doing church in the living room already, or some people, of course, are still kind of sheltering in place until the complete vaccine rollout has has happened or whatever. But yeah, so we still have some, we do have some that are coming back to church, like that original house church family. The day that church opened, they were back in the pews. You know what I mean? They were ready to come back. We didn't have children's programming or teen programming at the time when we first reopened. It was just main sanctuary, socially distanced, masked, all of that kind of stuff. They just brought their kids with them to the main sanctuary. But again, the beauty of doing a house church model is that they can come to church in the morning and then they can host house church on Sunday night, or they can host house church on Sunday afternoon or on Wednesday night if they want to, or whenever they want to do it. So you can still continue the model. And then it just creates another model of inclusive ministry for special needs families who just, it's too hard for them to come to church with their child. It's, you know, they don't have the transportation to get there. I mean, there's all kinds of barriers that doing this house church just kind of demolishes these barriers.
Right. Okay, so we got another question, and we've got time probably for this one and maybe one more, and then that's going to be it. But Carol is asking about how you're handling communion in house church. I mean, I know from personal experience, you know, my family, my husband and I have cobbled together sort of a fake little communion thing. And, you know, when it's been the Sunday that we do communion, but are you encouraging families to do that in their homes? Are you encouraging families to go back to church periodically so that they can do communion, you know, all together with the entire church body? Or, you know, what's your approach been for that?
We do it just like church. And so our senior pastor leads communion, right? So he leads the prayer. What we do is we either offer the host people, the host homes or whatever, the little, post COVID, we're using the little, pre-bought like grape juice things with the wafer on the top that's sealed. And so we can either give those to we can tell the host church people, the house church people to come and pick those up, or we can deliver those or whatever, or they can just order them online. What we have done, we didn't do any of that. We just got saltine crackers and grape juice from Publix. So, and again, it's not, it doesn't need to be because communion is a very sacred, it's a sacred thing. And so you don't want just everybody kind of leading communion if there hasn't been some type of training or something in knowing how to lead communion. And so we rely on our senior pastor to do that. So when he does it in church, we have the elements available. We pray and we do communion with our senior pastor, just like the rest of the in-person people are doing.
Excellent. Yeah, so a couple of comments.
I love what Bronwyn said. Sorry, one communion, maybe all we could find was popcorn and Starburst candy. But we did it.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, my husband and I had orange juice one Sunday when there was nothing similar to grape juice. I'm so sorry.
That felt weird, right?
Yeah. And then Andrea said that the Meeting House, which is a multi-site church in Canada, has been doing house church for a long time. And so, and plus, church in their main facility or campus. So that's all just really good.
So, and it's definitely not a new concept, right? Like this is not some like, oh, Jillian came up with this. No, I didn't. The disciples came up with that. And we've been doing it for a long time, but I think we just never related that to, oh, wow, that would work really well for special needs ministry because it just makes sense.
Yeah, it sure does. So, well, we are at the top of the hour. This has been so informative. And I just want to share a couple of quick things with the group. If you are looking for more information about kind of the nuts and bolts and questions to ask, Jillian wrote a couple of great blog posts on Key Ministries Church for Every Child blog. One was, I think, maybe both of them were actually the first couple of weeks of February. So just go look there. If you haven't seen those before, you'll get some more details about things that you could be thinking through. Jillian, if you are willing to take questions, if people have questions afterwards, can we share your email address in the chat?
Yes, please. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'll put my Together We Care one in here.
Okay. So that way you can, everybody can grab it before we sign off here. And I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that, we actually have a very busy calendar right now, and hope everybody can come back next week. We're going to be talking with Colleen Swindoll Thompson about parenting a child who's been through trauma. Trauma is obviously a very kind of hot topic in the culture, and it's a challenge for parents, perhaps like no other. And so Colleen has a lot of wisdom and insight that she'll be sharing with us. We have several other events that you'll want to check out on our events page. And yeah, so just thank you so much for joining today. And we hope to see all of you back here next month. Take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Can you list the email for me? I can't see the chat.
Oh, yes. It's T as in Tom, W as in watermelon. I don't know the actual codes for C as in cat, ATL, like the abbreviation for Atlanta, 2020@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Bye-bye.